So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me here. And today I'm presenting results of different research projects that my previous ones that were focused on the Chilean Song movement in Chile during the Allende government, and my current project on the OSPAAAL posters. I will talk about this organization later. So, in his book, Noise, economist Jacques Attali reflects on the consequence of judging a society rather by its statistics than by its sounds or its arts. He argues that by listening to noise, we can better understand where the folly of men and their calculations is leading us and what hopes it is still possible to have. And he claims that music possesses an anticipatory vocation as it makes audible the new world that will gradually become visible. End of quote. So, despite my skepticism regarding the suggestion of such a prophetic power, I agree with the view that certain changes are first processed or perceived in the cultural field before reaching or being perceived in the political sphere. And in certain instances, there is a deliberate undertaking in the artistic milieu to intervene in the course of society, foreseeing a desired future. As musicologist Tomás Turino reminds us, the arts exist at the intersection between the actual and the possible domains, forming a realm where the impossible or non-existent or the ideal is imagined and made possible. Well, in my research, my current and previous research projects, I paid special attention to the ways envisioned by latino-American artists to realize the revolutionary utopia, or what has been called the long 60s. As historian Claudia Hillman argues, revolutionary expectation and rapprochement between art and politics were hallmarks of that period, and accordingly, artists felt responsible for contributing to increase the subjective conditions that would lead to the Third World Revolution. And in this presentation, I will focus on the cases of the Chilean Song movement and the graphic art of the OSPAAAL, that was an NGO which was based in Cuba. I will present different aesthetic resources used by these musicians and visual artists in an attempt to build the desired identity and unity of what Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth. And I will also reflect on the limits of this project. So from about 1965, Chilean musicians such as Isabel Parra, Angel Parra, Patricio Mans, Victor Jara, and the members of the groups Quilapayún and Inti Illimani started to cultivate a repertoire that drew on Latin American folk genres to carry out political and social messages. Most of these musicians were affiliated with the youth wing of the Communist Party of Chile, and together with other artists, they supported the presidential candidacy of the socialist Salvador Allende in 1970. After Allende's victory, they supported his government, which proposed a peaceful transition to socialism, the so-called Chilean way to socialism. And this project was brutally interrupted by the coup d'etat of September 11, 1963, which led to the dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet. Although the so-called Chilean Song movement produced a very varied repertoire in musical terms, one of its hallmarks was the use of folklore in a Latino-Americanist perspective. This meant opposing the prevailing nationalist perspective in the Chilean media, which promoted rhythms such as cueca and tonada that were representatives of the Hispanic Catholic heritage as symbols of national identity. In contrast, the Chilean Song musicians argued that Chile's identity resided in its belonging to Latin America. This dispute can be seen by comparing two long plays. One of them was recorded by group Los Cuatro Cuartos in 1966 and has as its theme the War of the Pacific. This conflict took place between 1879 and 1884 and ended with the victory of Chile over the united force of Peru and Bolivia. And as a result, Chile gained a significant amount of resource-rich territory from both countries. And this 1966 record presents an epic version of the war, extolling the Chilean heroes. According to a member of the Chilean Song group in Chile, the record provoked protests in Peru and, in his words, hurt my latino-américaines sensibility. In his memoirs, another member of the movement, Osvaldo Rodriguez, highlighted that, in his words, what arose in those years in Chile was not a problem concerning Chilean music, but Latin American music as a common expression. In other words, it was assumed that there would be a cultural identity linking the different musical expressions of the region. And one of the first records which took a clear Latin Americanist perspective was El Sueño Americano, The American Dream, by Patricio Manz. It was launched in 1967. This work sought to demonstrate that the Latin American countries were linked by a common past and present, and they should build together the future. So its first part focuses on Spanish rule in the colonial period. The second brings to light the new imperialism imposed by the United States on the newly independent countries. And the last is a call to end foreign exploitation on the continent. And to this end, it would be necessary to rescue the unity confiscated by the enemy to fight it. In addition to the lyrics, the rapprochement between different parts of the continent is also accomplished by using a variety of folk genres, which include malambo, baguala, refalosa, vidala, cueca, chacarera, samba, and polo margariteño. And those are genres from different Latin American countries and regions. So, with the same vein, the song Si Somos Americanos, If We Are Americans, by Rolando Alarcón, attributes to music a fundamental role in the consolidation of Latin American unity. It says, if we are Americans, we are brothers, we will be good neighbors, we will be one song. The Chilean Song groups were the main diffusers of this Latin Americanist perspective. For example, group Guamari, who wrote in the liner notes of their first record launched in 1971. Our commitment is to the people, and our people are Chile and America. Similarly, the liner notes for the record Instrumental Andino by group Curacas explained that on the one hand, this is the liner notes of the record. On the one hand, this record is the personal song of Chile with Latin American instruments. And on the other hand, it's the song of America. It's the union of transparent cultural rivers that go back to the past and end in a common sea, Latin America. So the Latin American spirit explains why the Chilean Song groups mainly focused on the Andean repertoire. According to a member of group Quilapayún, in his words, because the Andean region is common to several countries, Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile, the music born there served very well to bridge the barriers of a limited and Creole nationalism. So rescuing and disseminating continental folk genres was understood by those musicians as a way to combat cultural U.S. imperialism, which was defined by the members of the group Inti Limani as an alienating pressure inclined, among other things, to eradicate and replace the basic and native Latin American cultures. So in their conception, the struggle for cultural sovereignty would be necessary to reach political sovereignty, an objective that would demand the subjugated countries to be united. Okay, thank you. At the same time that the Chilean Song musicians began to record their first songs, Cuba sought to coordinate the revolutionary struggles of the so-called Third World. In January 1966, Havana hosted the Tricontinental Conference, which brought together representatives of 82 Latin American, Africa, and Asian countries to discuss a collective political platform. One of the main fruits of the meeting was the creation of the Organization of Solidarity of the Peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, or OSPAAAL, which existed from 1966 to 2019. It had a department focused on information and propaganda, and one of its main published materials was the Tricontinental magazine, conceived as the theoretical body of OSPAAAL. And in its first issue, the editorial stated as main objectives to understand the great problems faced by the peoples of the Third World and how to overcome them, in addition to systematically denounce imperialism. The magazine discussed aspects that were understood at that time as common to Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Recurring topics were the experience of colonization in the past and or present, the unequal and dependent insertion of these regions in the global design of capitalism, and their revolutionary potential. And these theoretical debates were allied to attempts to consolidate networks of militant solidarity. Most issues of the Tricontinental magazine included a folded poster. About 330 different posters were produced by OSPAAAL until 2002, and a few dozen more over the next 17 years. As with the posters created by other Cuban institutions, there was a huge stylistic variety in OSPAAAL posters, which refused the socialist realism model, preferring styles such as pop art, op art, constructivism, and the Polish poster school, among other references. So challenged to create images that corresponded to this third world envisioned by OSPAAAL, the artists working for it resorted to different strategies. One of them was to present the text of the poster simultaneously in 4 different languages: Spanish, English, French, and Arabic. But the images always prevailed over the text to allow non-speakers of these languages, as well as illiterate people, to understand their messages. OSPAAAL artists also resorted to certain symbols to connect struggles carried out in different contexts, both symbols of oppression, such as worn clothes, barbed wire, handcuffs, chains, and the swastika, and symbols of resistance, such as the clenched fist, were encompassed. Among them, the weapons depicted were especially significant because they allowed for establishing relationships between past and present struggles, as well as to differentiate between legitimate and illegitimate types of violence. Weapons were recurrently portrayed to reiterate the idea that the liberation of the Third World could only take place through the armed path, as demonstrated by the 3 posters. The poster on Asia demonstrates that the OSPAAAL poster systematically incorporated an artifact typical of the region's native tradition, often accompanied by a symbol of modern armed resistance that would be defending that tradition. And these three posters also demonstrate that in the OSPAAAL graphic art, the weapons associated with revolutionary movements were always light weapons typical of guerrillas, such as AK rifles, grenades, and carbines. For the imperialist side, however, there were planes, tanks, and heavy weapons. OSPAAAL and colonialist posters often connected past and present, conceiving them not as opposites, but as a continuation of the same cultural and struggle legacy. For example, in these posters that support national liberation movements in Mozambique and Zimbabwe, indigenous arrows destroy the Portuguese Empire, represented by the Order of Christ cross, and the English Empire, represented by the colonial pith helmet. In this way, a connection is established between contemporary independence movements and the first struggles carried out against the imposition of the colonial order in Africa. Similarly, one of the many OSPAAAL posters dedicated to Vietnamese combatants in the context of the Vietnam War displays a bow with AK-47 occupying the place of the arrow and ready to be thrown. By bringing together weapons used by the Vietnamese to resist different invading forces of the 19th and 20th century, the image establishes a continuity between French colonialism and US imperialism. And besides this symbology used, these three posters are also similar from an aesthetical point of view, this being another way of bringing different contexts together. OSPAAAL also published posters that cover the three continents simultaneously. Both the cover of the 10th issue of the Tricontinental magazine and the poster distributed along with it were created to celebrate the 3rd anniversary of the Tricontinental Conference in 1969. By depicting men considered representatives of the three continents as armed combatants and suggesting that their body parts would be interchangeable, both images convey a message of identity and alliance against a common enemy, regardless of how geographically or linguistically distant the revolutionary movements could be. So the Latin American left of the 60s and 70s insisted on the thesis that the oppressed peoples of the world shared an identity and should unite to face a strong common enemy, that is, the imperial powers. Among them, the United States was the most recurrently attacked for threatening national sovereignty in different parts of the world. In addition to denouncing the situation, the artists sought to contribute to making Latin America and Third World units real. In the case of the Chilean Song, it was done mainly by addressing social and political issues common to different countries in the region and by merging folk instruments and folk rhythms from different parts of the region. In turn, OSPAAAL posters resorted to common symbols and aesthetics to bring different contexts together and preferred images over texts to allow their messages to be understandable worldwide. Also, in the two cases presented, the imagined future was announced as the moment of victory for struggles undertaken in the past and continued into the present. However, the realization of these utopias proved to be difficult even in the artist's own works. For example, in 1971, after getting to know the members of the Chilean group Quilapayún, Fidel Castro decided to create a similar group in Cuba. It was named Manguaré, and its members traveled to Chile for 6 months to learn from the Chilean Song musicians. As they explained in an interview, the profound difference between the musical practices of the two countries made their learning very difficult. In one of its members' words, we had to learn to play the guitar again, to sing in a different way, and to know a lot of instruments that we had never seen before. As historian Javier Rodriguez noted, although musicians frequently evoked the existence of a common musical language in Latin American folklore, Manguaré found it very difficult to reproduce a folkloric practice that was far from any familiar reference. In turn, scholars have been recognizing issues of authorness in the OSPAAAL graphic art. The artists working for the organization were all Cuban, and most of them had never traveled abroad. Therefore, they often portrayed contexts they knew little about. Although the posters proposed by them were analyzed by the organization's international executive secretariat before being published, they at times reiterated Western stereotypes about the East, disregarded historical specificities, and tended to racialize the peoples of each continent. So these case studies demonstrate that artists have sought ways to contribute to realize utopias envisioned in their times. And although these utopias have not materialized, the persistence of these works as references for later generations, including from a critical perspective, allows us to question the notion of failure. Thank you.